All right, so now we're on to part 4 here from part 3. I introduced homeostasis in part 3, right? So we're trying to maintain a constant internal environment. This is mainly from the fact that external environments is really out there to kill us. Not necessarily in a mean way, but because we live in a fallen world, it's just out to get us, right? So there's pathogens, there's change in temperature, there's dry, there's wet, you name it, environment externally is trying to get us, right? So internally, to maintain life, the body's designed to maintain its environment consistently with variation and fluctuation, which is perfectly fine. In fact, that as an engineer, that's beautiful that the body system is designed to handle variances. But we'll maintain pretty much a constant state if you're a healthy adult or human. An example we often like to show this in is body temperature. So in terms of body temperature in Fahrenheit, we traditionally hang around 98.6. There's some data that show that's not exactly true. It can go a little higher than that. But this is actually in adults. And babies, the normal body temperature is slightly different. In Celsius, this is around 37 degrees Celsius, right? So you, as nursing students, need to be aware of Celsius and metric units. Most of the world uses metric units in Celsius. So when we go to other countries and so forth, you'll need to understand that. And a lot of times drugs are, and doctor notes are in Celsius or in metric, like grams and so forth, or liters or milliliters. So just a thing to be aware of, right? But we fluctuate around this normal point. It's an average, right, of 98.6 or 37 degrees Celsius, right? How we regulate homeostasis in the body is through feedback loops, right? So this is loops of both cellular communication systems, hormones, a whole bunch of different things come together in our tissues and organs and organ systems to maintain whatever given homeostasis state we're trying to regulate. Blood pressure, temperature, water content, cells, you name it, it's on some sort of feedback loop system. And what do I mean by feedback loop system? Well, there's two different types. A negative feedback, where say you have a signal, say, your blood pressure is rising, your cardiovascular system senses that, so it sends a signal saying, hey, decrease blood pressure, right? So you're trying to reduce something because you're having too much of something, right? So that's a negative feedback. Same with body temperature. The body can sense, hey, we're getting too hot here. We're like 99.3 Fahrenheit. We got to cool down. Start sweating. Do whatever it takes to cool down, right? Because you're getting too much of something, right? So you're trying to push something or reduce something. So a negative feedback. There's also a positive feedback, which you're trying to propel something to, make something more, go beyond the homeostasis barrier, right, for some reason. A lot of this positive feedback, examples from the textbook, is related to human reproduction, especially when it comes to male anatomy there, right? Because there's a normal homeostasis the body's trying to maintain, but if for a normal function and it needs to go beyond that barrier, kind of a chemical barrier, energetic barrier, it needs to kind of build and build and build up, right? It's building up like a snowball rolling downhill from the same signal going back to the beginning and saying, hey, make more of this, more and more and more. It's a positive feedback to make it kind of a grand kind of overcoming of that barrier, right? So there's not as many positive feedback systems in our body, so it's typically not as found predominantly as well as negative feedback, right? Because most of the time the body just runs out of control naturally. So you want to hold it back, like a reins on a horse, you want to hold it back. You don't really want to let the horse run free, right? Which is kind of like a positive feedback. So most of the time we'll be focusing in on negative feedback, but positive feedback is needed. The body does utilize it, but just not as much as negative. So how does this feedback loop work? Well, in terms of our organs and tissues, we're really kind of looking more at the cellular level, because the cells, remember, we're cellular organisms. We utilize the cell to produce functions and produce the tissues and so forth. So the cells are really going to be the ones responding to these external signals and feedback signals. So on the cell, there's what's called a receptor. Typically, it's a protein, but these receptors kind of detect and receive signals or stimulus from outside the cell, which then elicits a response, which kind of sends, the receptors send that signal to the control center, which is typically, in the cells, the nucleus. If we're talking about tissues at the tissue level, right, there's the brain, right? So if we're talking about a larger scale feedback loop system, right, the receptor, that example could be, you just tripped and hurt yourself, right? So your neurons felt gravity break a bone, right? So then that signal is going to send the pain signal to your brain, to the control center of the brain, right? To take that input from the pain receptors in your neurons to elicit a response saying, hey, now we need to maintain homeostasis. We just broke a bone, start the homeostasis response to that. And that's kind of a larger scale example of that, because then you have an effector, which is the response to the control center signal saying, okay, we need to do something about this, right? All this is to say we have receptors receiving a signal, we have a control center of some sort, looks different at different levels, receiving the signal and then initiating some sort of response, which is our effector, right? To push us back to homeostasis, right? In terms of a negative feedback here, right? In terms of body temperature, right? So the body detects that we are disturbing, like on the bottom end here or the top end. We're going hot, right? So your body senses that, receptors in the brain receive that signal, stimulate sweat gland production, dilate our blood vessels, right, at the skin to kind of increase blood flow there to transfer more heat out, right, which the signals from the brain are sent to those two, the sweat glands and the capillaries and so forth, blood vessels, to dilate them and produce sweat, which would hopefully drop our body temperature, right? So that's when it's hot. When it's cold, kind of same receptors and control center response, but instead of dilating blood vessels or increasing sweat production, you want to stop sweat production and kind of constrict our blood vessels and activate skeletal muscle contraction, right? Shivering, because a lot of our heat that is produced really from a chemical reaction comes from our muscles, right? Because we got to maintain 98.6. So that's a negative feedback example there, right? So there's always a receptor, control center, and an effector sent out. A great example of positive feedback in terms of signaling building up beyond homeostasis is positive feedback. Well, I did not give birth to Wesley. My wife did. I got to observe this firsthand. It is an amazing experience, but to see this in effect, it was great. But really, in order to give birth, you have to have this positive feedback because the child needs to, leave the womb in some form or fashion, right? Homeostasis during pregnancy is the body wants to keep the child in the womb, right? That's where development is occurring. But at some point, the child, which we don't know necessarily how or why, the mother and the child both know it's time to give birth. When that signal is initiated, you build up this kind of oxytocin, which is a hormone. You build up this signal from the stretching of the uterus to the brain, which is the receptor, the control center for this, at the pituitary gland, which then causes the release of oxytocin, which causes muscle contraction in the uterus, right? And then as the uterus stretches from the contractions, It sends more signals to the brain, which then causes more oxytocin release, so forth and so forth and so on until the magic of life happens and the baby is born. Right? So this is an example of positive feedback because you got to build over and get beyond that homeostasis, which is keeping the child in the womb. So I'll pause there. We have one more part to go, which is anatomical directions, right? So this is the anatomy that we'll get into the next part, which we will all just have to memorize. So I'll see you in part 5.